As we continue our look into gardens of Shakespeare's lifetime, we're asking this week, did Shakespeare have a privy garden? In Richard II and Hamlet, William Shakespeare has characters refer to what's called an estate garden. And Hamlet specifically uses the analogy of an unweeded garden with rampant plants going wild into chaos, taking over the place, to describe the corruption and weakening of the government he sees under his stepfather, Claudius. It's an ominous scene filled with tension, but it might leave some who haven't studied the history of William Shakespeare to ask, why a garden, Hamlet? Well, it turns out that for Shakespeare and people living in England during his lifetime, gardens were a status symbol, right down to each individual plant having its own particular reputation and aspects that were related to it, whether it was the Tudor knot garden, which Shakespeare would have had at New Place in Stratford-upon-Avon, or the privy gardens of more higher locations like the castle Hamlet is speaking from in the play. Plants were symbolic and they held a great deal of importance, which makes them very useful as plot devices for someone like William Shakespeare. While the word privy garden simply means a private garden and could apply to anyone that had such a space on their property for the growing of plants that they tended meticulously, the title the privy garden applies to the specific garden at Hampton Court Palace. This was put there by Cardinal Wolsey in the 16th century. Behind the only remaining part of Whitehall Palace that still exists today, which is Banqueting House, was a garden attached to an orchard. This was a pleasure garden mostly, with the orchard supplying fruit for the estate, and at the time it was known as the Great Garden. The space itself was not as urban as it is now, and so surrounding this area were lots of parks and hunting grounds, including St. James Park, which was a royal hunting ground. As you'll find out inside this week's episode of That Shakespeare Life, when our guest, Brigitte Webster, visits with us to describe Tudor knot gardens in particular, Henry VIII kicked off the Tudor knot garden fashion. Henry's Tudor knot garden was elaborately decorated. His garden included intricate designs and decorations. Visiting in 1544, the Spanish Duke wrote that the garden was, quote, very pleasant, with great walks and avenues in all directions, containing many sculptures of men and women, children and birds, and monsters, and other strange figures in low and high relief. A visitor from within Shakespeare's lifetime, von Weedel, who came to the garden in 1584 when William Shakespeare was 20 years old. This was the same year that Shakespeare's daughter Susanna turned 1, and Christopher Marlowe received his bachelor's degree. In 1584 it was also when the Virginia colony of Roanoke Island was established by Sir Walter Raleigh. It was at this time that von Weedel recorded the garden had 34 high columns covered with various fine paintings, also different animals carved in wood with their horns gilt, set on the top of the columns, together with flags bearing the Queen's arms. In the middle of the garden is a nice fountain with a remarkable sundial showing the time in 30 different ways. Between the spaces that are planted in the garden, there are fine walks down the grass, and the spaces are planted very artistically, surrounded by plants in the shape of seats. Brigitte Webster writes in her article for Tudor's Dynasty about this kind of seat that you would have seen in a Tudor knot garden when she describes how we know what the designs and layout of the privy gardens of this period actually looked like. She says, quote, the first fact I had to accept is that in Britain there is no Tudor garden left. Every single one is a much later recreation, some more authentic than others. The design for early Tudor knot gardens, for example, continues to be a matter of conjecture among garden historians. She goes on to describe a few that are authentically historic, although not necessarily dating to the Tudor period themselves, with one at Whitehall Palace and another being described inside an herbal of 1551 and the Great Herbal of 1526. And those are great places to look if you want to see what they would have looked like during Shakespeare's lifetime or when Henry VIII actually planted his. The turf seats that Brigitte describes, that were the same kind von Weedel talked about earlier, were sometimes built against a wall or even around a tree. You see something similar in gardens today. The arms could be made of brick or stone, and there was a seat about 18 inches off the ground where you could sit in the garden. So Shakespeare's interest in gardens and the use of them in his plays is not purely poetic. It's also a reference to the importance of garden spaces going on in his lifetime. Private gardens, called privy gardens, would have been created and maintained as a status symbol, and starting about the 1500s, a specific kind of privy city garden called the Tudor Knot Garden would make its way into existence as a fancy thing to do if you're high up and a gentleman like William Shakespeare wanted to be. In these specific style of gardens, symmetry and geometry were very important, as well as the use of topiaries and evergreen plants. We'll take a detailed look at Tudor gardens in the next episode of Did Shakespeare, so I hope you come back next Saturday for that. That's it for this week here at Did Shakespeare. I'm Cassie Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. Don't forget to check out our brand new membership area. There are already some courses loaded in there for you that you get access to immediately when you become a member, such as courses on authentic Tudor recipes Shakespeare talks about in his plays. We also teach you how to play some Elizabethan games that Shakespeare talks about in his plays. Those are already in the membership area, but each month we add a new course. This week we'll be adding a course on Shakespeare and gardens. This video will be a part of that course, but you will also get access to downloadable guides, which lists off for you various plants that you can find in Shakespeare's plays, as well as instructions on how you can make your own Shakespeare garden at home. All of that and more can be found inside the membership area, and you can sign up to be a part of that right now at cassiecash.com/member. That's it for this week. I'll see you next week. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.